Star Wars Outlaws sees a fair number of cutbacks on Switch 2, but there's also a lot of continuity. Crucially, the game retains its ray tracing effects. Ray-traced, diffuse GI still fills the world with soft, believable balanced light that grounds spaces and makes objects feel like they respect one another. The biggest difference on Switch 2 here lies in the stability of that lighting presentation. In this shot, for instance, this large, emissive material illuminates the concession area with a soft orange glow, and that's true on both Series S and Switch 2. But the lighting on Switch 2 has a subtle peppering of coarse noise, while Series S looks fairly faultless, which is clearer if I speed up this footage a bit. Likewise for this scene, which is filled with all kinds of noise from diffuse and specular GI. Camera movement is the easiest means to expose flaws in the game's RTGI, as a tilt of the right stick, even a gentle pan, can expose noisy bright holes. But this behavior is present in the game across all platforms, except perhaps for the PC code with DLSS ray reconstruction, and surfacing this issue on Series S is relatively trivial. There are some qualitative differences too. If I flash back and forth between platforms, we find that Switch 2 tends to be a little coarser, and sometimes looks overly dark or missing some lighting. But conversely, there are plenty of cases where the lighting looks similar, and even a few where Switch 2 scores a win over Series S. Take this emissive sign for instance. There's a subtle shadow beneath the Switch 2 sign, which is missing on Series S. That trend continues with the game's RT reflections. In a few instances, the Switch 2 version of the game appears to have some specular superiority over Series S. In this hangar, for instance, all this reflective detail basically only exists in screen space on Series S. But on Switch 2, note how there's no holes in the reflection around K, and how the reflections of the barrels persist even when off-screen. Then there's this shot. Here we see a relatively smooth metal surface, reflecting some fairly clear pinpoints of light on Switch 2. Series S has reflections as well, but they're very diffuse in comparison. Or compare this shot, where the underside of the metal overhang appears smooth and reflective on Switch 2, and much more diffuse on Series S. It's also reflecting this area correctly, unlike Series S, with a closer resemblance to Series X in performance mode. If we walk through Miragana City, these differences become obvious. Switch 2 has smooth metals that reflect environmental detail more sharply. On materials that appear glossy on all platforms, sometimes Switch 2 will have more obvious, brighter reflections. At the same time, the resolution of the ray tracing likely takes a hit on Nintendo's hybrid, with blurrier results on near smooth surfaces. Bodies of water showcase similar reflections across the Xboxes and Switch though, with a close final result. In current Snowdrop Engine games, most of the ray-traced world is textureless and uses lower detail models, which diminishes the effectiveness of the reflections somewhat on mirror-like planes. But for diffuse GI it works well, and reflections on most surfaces typically look decent too. Of course, these are characteristics that are common across all platforms, so there's nothing particularly problematic about Switch 2. Shadows tend to be blurrier and blockier on Switch 2 as well, with obviously diminished resolution. In cutscenes, Kay's hair isn't shadowed as effectively, and clothing often lacks self-shadows as well. Distant shadows do appear to be ray-traced, however, just like the other console platforms. Volumetric lighting appears stripped back in some spots and absent in others, while volumetric fog appears cut down on the Switch as well. But volumetric clouds look very handsome on the hybrid. It's challenging to line up an exact comparison owing to weather RNG, but the visual result is very comparable. Beyond lighting, there are all kinds of tweaks and cuts to the game's assets. In this shot, for instance, some of the overhead cabling and bits of clutter are absent on Switch. In Miragana, the netting and wiring is absent on Switch 2 as well. Less detailed models also abound, with their blockier curves and softened textures. Switch 2 comes in at a relatively svelte 20 gigabytes, less than a third the size of its console forebears, and those concessions are obvious in some scenes and shots. But those changes are very area dependent. Many shots mirror each other, with reduced density assets only apparent on close inspection. As a rule of thumb, expect to find few differences in mission areas and enclosed spaces, with greater cutbacks in cities and certain open areas. Foliage and grass density tend to take a hit on the hybrid too, though not obnoxiously so. NPCs seem reduced in number as well, but I don't think you'd really notice the difference in actual gameplay. Image quality on Switch 2 is pretty solid overall. Edges are smoothed gracefully, disocclusion looks fine, and the image is sharp. When docked, Outlaws uses DLSS with DRS, with typical resolutions around 720p and an output res of 1440p. Series S, in contrast, operates between 720p and 1080p internally, with an output at 1440p using FSR. Both look equally sharp and are relatively stable in static shots. Moving through the world, Series S is a little more temporally coherent on distant geometry, but Switch 2 doesn't have the characteristic FSR disocclusion fizzle around K's torso. Hair cards are a Switch 2 pain point, though FSR isn't perfect either. The game's alpha-tested grasses tend to resolve a bit less cleanly on the Switch as well. And of course, ray-traced lighting detail isn't as clean on Switch 2, though that's not a fault with DLSS. Image quality overall favors Series S, though it's a closer matchup than I initially expected.